So the main cover story on the newspaper on the 9th of October, 2 days ago, was about the security threat from Iran. Um, MI5 warns about Iran plots on British soil. This is the cover. Now, before getting into this, there is overlap, obviously, with the last video, the war in the Near East. Obvious overlap. 2024 has probably been the most intense friction between Israel and Iran in modern times. They've never been friends, at least not since 1979. Um, but it's particularly bad right now. And we've seen escalation after escalation. That's why the situation in the Middle East right now is particularly concerning. It's not that it's ever peaceful. I mean, we can't point to any, certainly not in my lifetime, where we could say the Middle East has been problem free. There has always been conflicts there, there's always been tensions, a lot of them overlapping with the conflict in the Holy Land. But it has got particularly bad this year. Now, I I think that Iran is definitely one of the worst influences in the region in terms of escalating this. I think, you could criticize Israel, you could criticize the state of Israel, you could say all of that, but in the end of the day, Iran is influencing these groups more than influencing them. It's openly arming them. Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas, um, they are Iranian proxies. And if we look at the geography, Iran doesn't directly border Israel. You have the whole of Iraq between the two. Um, but the Iranian people, I don't think, want a war with Israel. And if you look at the way Iran treats its own people, absolutely repugnant. Now, one of the reasons I don't join those pro-Palestinian demonstrators is their hypocrisy on singling Israel out, but turning a blind eye to what, for example, the Iranian regime does to its own people, or for that matter, the Assad regime does to its own people. I mean, 500,000 have died in the war in Syria in the last decade. Um, it's one of the major wars in modern times. And yeah, that's kind of, it was big news at the time, but it's kind of been, you don't see the same level of protest against Arab dictators or the Iranian regime as you do with the criticism of Israel. But that's, it's striking. I'm just going to read out report here because the head of MI5, Ken McCallum, has warned that Russia and Iran are trying to influence disorder in our streets. I'm going to read this out. This report's by Katie Donaldson. Russia and Iran are adopting many of the same strategies with the Kremlin's Foreign Military Intelligence Service agency, the GRU, aiming to cause chaos on British soil, the head of MI5 said. Since European capitals expelled more than 750 Russian diplomatic staff in the wake of the Salisbury poisoning attack in 2018, the GRU has begun investing heavily in advanced cyber attacks, said Ken McCallum. But like Iran, a more eye-catching shift this year has been Russian state actors turning to proxies for the dirty work, including private intelligence operatives and criminals from both the UK and third countries. Actually, that piece is more about the Russian aspect, but there is a big deal of overlap here. Um, the other report, this is a double page coverage, also by Kitty Donaldson. Iran could repurpose its criminal network in the UK away from targeting dissidents to attacking Britons directly if tensions between Israel and Iran escalate, the head of the security service warned yesterday. Tehran has overseen plot after plot at unprecedented pace and scale in Britain, the MI5 Director General Ken McCallum revealed as he said he was alive to the possibility of Tehran broadening its range of targets on UK soil. Since January 2022, there have been 20 Iranian plots aimed at dissidents and journalists in the UK, 5 of them this year. And then it goes on to talk about the Russian threat as well. And just looking at, there's several different reports on this, so just trying to keep this condensed. Quite a lot of coverage. Mr. McCallum's warning about the threat from Tehran came after Sir Keir Starmer refused to rule out UK military involvement in Israel's response to Iran's missile attack last week. Here warned MPs on Monday that the Middle East is close to the brink and in very real danger of a regional war. Um, he also accused Iran of being a malign force in the region. Well, he's absolutely right about that. There's also an opinion piece by an Iranian journalist, Nazanin Ansari, and she speaks about certainly the fear of Israeli bombs in her homeland, but she also speaks about the importance that Westerners understand the nature of Hezbollah and Iran's proxies. Um, and this is quite a poignant point she makes. The truth is, people who feel sympathy for innocent Palestinians being bombed by Israel should feel the same towards innocent Iranians who have suffered or perished under dictatorship. Hundreds of them, if not thousands. There's been several attempted uprisings, as she points out. There have been many attempted uprisings since the clerics took power, but they have gathered pace since the 1999 protests. 2009, that was a big one, the so-called Green Revolution. That was one where the young woman Neda Sultan, I believe her name was, there was striking images of her being gunned down. 2015, 2017, 2019, 2022, and last year. And the most recent ones came over another young woman being killed by the regime. The slogans used by demonstrators are becoming progressively more strident. So there is something of a momentum in Iran. I think the Iranian people, young Iranians, are very, very drained of this ghastly regime. But there is a sense that the protest is increasing. You know, it's not now once a decade. It's now happening every few years. Large scale demonstrations against the regime. Um, I think it's very, very important to understand that two things. We often hear the Iranian regime appropriate Iranian culture. This is something similar to the Chinese Communist Party. In both cases, you have relatively new regimes. The Chinese Communist Party is 100 years old, over that. The Iranian regime, that is the Islamic regime, is what, 45 years old. In both cases, they appropriate ancient cultures. In the case of China, they go back, they talk about 5,000 years of civilization. There's some debate over that exact chronology, but nevertheless, China is an ancient civilization. Iran's an ancient civilization. You know, some of the oldest sites in the world are indeed in Iran, Sumer, and so on. In both cases, they appropriate that. So when there is Western rhetoric against Iran, the clerics cynically talk about we're an ancient civilization. I remember a couple of years ago, two Iranian women I knew, they were big critics of the regime, but they were frustrated by some Western rhetoric on Iran. And I pointed out the issue the West has is not with the Iranian people, and it's not with an ancient civilization, it's with this ghastly regime. That's the point. Um, the biggest threat to the Iranian people is not Israel, it's not the West, it's their own regime. And now they are posing a real threat on British soil. I think Mr. McCallum needs to be taken seriously. I think one problem in this country, I haven't spoken about the Tory leadership contest, but one thing about James Cleverly, I think he was too cautious regarding China. Um, I think we need to see three countries particularly as existential threats: Russia, China, and Iran. Those three regimes, not their people, but those three regimes are an existential threat to this country. All three have posed an obvious threat. In the case of Russia, perhaps most glaringly of all, that attack at Salisbury didn't just target two Russian dissidents, it put British citizens in danger. Indeed, a British citizen, Don Sturgis, died. That was an act of state terrorism by the Russian Federation against Britain. If Iran escalates its threats beyond Iranian dissidents, which is bad enough, to actually threaten British citizens, it's really grave. We had the case recently of a soldier who was accused of supplying information to Iran, the young soldier. He's denied the charges. Um, but we should not underestimate malevolent forces exploiting the conflict between Israel and its neighbours to potentially target British citizens. Iran is absolutely a malign influence. China, not necessarily in terms of violence, but in terms of, for example, having these shady police stations operating in some Chinese businesses. They deny it. Confucius Institute should be absolutely shut down. I'm extremely frustrated by the weakness successive British governments have shown on China. I mean, they seem to be a lot more cautious in the language than they are with Russia. I'm pleased that successive governments have taken a hard line with Russia, but I think we've been too weak when it comes to China, particularly China. There's been sanctions against Iran, but I want to know that the Starmer government is taking this very seriously. And I want to know that they're treating Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran as, I don't want to say an axis of evil and use up Bush like language because the war on terror was deeply flawed. But I do think we have to recognize that these are regimes we cannot trust. And, those who are anti Israel, this goes beyond Israel. It's absolutely the Israelis are right to feel an existential threat, but the Iranian regime, Iran's what I would call a middle power. It doesn't have the same clout as Russia or China, but nor is it a small country. Um, and a Russian Iranian alliance is definitely a toxic combination. So absolutely, we have to take this seriously. Um, yes, we have sanctions with Iran. We don't at the moment have diplomatic severance, and I'm not suggesting we necessarily should. During the Cold War, there was always a hotline between Moscow and London, so it may make some sense that there's some connection between London and Tehran. I mean, if you had a situation where British citizens were imprisoned there, you would need some sort of measure to eventually get them freed. Usually, what happens with the Americans is they go for a third party. So there is some sense in having some connection with your enemies. But in terms of what's happening in Britain, I think MI5 needs to be, listened to. Um, I also think that there's radicalization online. I think there is a problem with young people getting influenced. There is a lot of bad faith actors involved in this. We've heard a lot about the far right this summer, and that's a problem. It needs to be taken seriously. But there are other actors who are poisoning cyberspace: Russia, China, and Iran. Um, Perhaps other regimes as well. You're going to find, for example, there will be online misinformation regarding the politics in countries like India. Um, but whilst I think I don't entirely trust India, quite frankly, especially under Modi, but I don't put it on par with the other three examples I've given. Um, you know, we just cannot trust these regimes, and so long as they are in power, we need to take it seriously. I'm not talking about paranoia, um, and I'm not proposing a Trump like let's ban everyone from those countries, but I do think successive governments have been too cautious, and I don't think they have listened to the security services as much as they should. Um, it isn't inconceivable that Iran might try some sort of something along the lines of Salisbury against Iranian dissidents. Who knows? Um, and as for the Chinese, it's not necessarily manifested in violence in the same way. They're a little bit more subtle than the Kremlin, but if you look at, for example, the violence that took place outside the Manchester consulate last year when there were protesters, but it looked like embassy staff were physically trying to drag them into the compound in order to sort of make it look like they were under attack. Um, Absolutely, we should be taking a harder line with China. Successive governments, Labour and Tory, have been far too weak on China, and I'm deeply frustrated by it. As an example, Rishi Sunak's government said they would close Confucius Institutes. They failed to do that. Instead, they simply withdrew government support. It's pathetic. So we need to take this situation seriously. And yeah, I hope the government's listening to MI5 and taking appropriate measures. But those who are on the streets for Palestinians, if you're holding a Hezbollah sign or a Hamas sign, you may think that's anti-Israel. That's actually an insult to every victim of terrorism. Because one point about October the 7th, obviously it was primarily in Israel and Israelis, but there were many other nationalities involved. 21 Thai citizens died in those attacks. There were Filipinos killed. That was aimed at primarily Israel, but other nationalities were involved. Anyway, I'll wrap this up. But yeah, I think the Iranian regime is ghastly. Even leaving aside their toxic influence in the region, the way they treat their own people, the human rights record of Iran is repugnant. Um, and I do think that focusing on Israel is probably a cynical attempt for the regime to, you know, uh, deflect from its own problems.